I still remember the exact temperature of that night, 93 degrees. The air conditioning had broken 2 days before, and my mother kept saying she'd call someone Monday morning. She never got the chance. I was 17 when the fire took everything from me. My parents, my younger brother Danny, my grandmother who lived in the room at the end of the hall, and the only version of myself I ever knew how to be. They said I survived because my bedroom window faced the backyard and because I woke up before the smoke detector did. They said I was lucky. For 10 years, I've carried that word like a stone in my throat. Lucky. I haven't been back to Millbrook since the funeral. After the hospital released me, after the social workers placed me with my aunt in Philadelphia, after the investigation concluded and the insurance paid out, I built a new life on top of the ashes of the old one. I changed my major twice in college. I worked jobs that required no attachment, temping, freelance editing, dog walking for people who asked no personal questions. I dated men who couldn't quite reach me, and I let them go without much of a fight when they stopped trying. I kept my hair long because Danny used to braid it while we watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, and cutting it felt like erasing him further. But something about turning 29, about approaching the age my mother was when she had me, made the ghosts louder. I started dreaming about the house every night. Not the fire exactly, but the moments before. Danny and I fighting over the remote. My dad's laugh from the kitchen, the creak of the third stair, my grandmother's humming from behind her closed door. I'd wake up reaching for things that weren't there, my fingers closing on empty air, and the loneliness of it became unbearable. So I bought a plane ticket. I told myself it was just to see the town one more time, to visit the cemetery, to finally say goodbye in a way that felt real. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I rented a car at the airport and drove the 40-minute route I used to know by heart, watching the landscape shift from highway sprawl to the particular shade of green that belongs to rural Pennsylvania in late October. The leaves were turning, reds and golds against a sky so blue it hurt. Millbrook looked smaller than I remembered. The drugstore had a different name. The movie theater had closed, but the essentials remained. The white church steeple, the diner with its red vinyl booths, the elementary school where Danny and I used to race to the swings. I drove past all of it with my hands tight on the wheel, not ready to stop, not ready to be seen, not yet. The house, or what's left of it, sits on Oakwood Avenue, third lot from the corner. The town never rebuilt it. Someone bought the property from the insurance company, then apparently changed their mind or ran out of money. And for 10 years it's just sat there, a skeleton of foundation and chimney, slowly being swallowed by weeds and wild vines. I parked across the street and sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could make myself get out. The afternoon sun slanted through the overgrown grass, turning everything amber and unreal. I could see the outline of where the porch used to be, where my dad planted rosemary every spring because he said it made the whole house smell like memory. The chimney still stood, blackened and cracked, like a monument to what fire can't quite finish. I walked up what used to be the driveway, gravel crunching under my feet, and with every step the air got heavier, like I was breathing through gauze. That's when I saw him. A figure standing at the far edge of the property, near where the back fence used to separate our yard from the woods. Just standing there, completely still, watching me. My first instinct was fear, that primal animal response to being observed by a stranger in a place that feels sacred and private. But something about the way he held himself, shoulders curved inward, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, made him seem less like a threat and more like someone waiting for permission. I stopped walking. We stared at each other across the ruins of my childhood. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, with grey threading through dark hair, and a face that seemed carved by too much sun or too much worry. I didn't recognize him, but something about his presence felt deliberate, like he'd been expecting me. "Hello?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, swallowed by the October wind and the rustling of dead leaves. He took one step forward, then stopped, as if approaching too quickly might shatter something fragile between us. "You're Claire," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. My heart kicked against my ribs. "Who are you?" "My name is Michael Reeves." He paused, watching my face for recognition. When he found none, he added, "I was one of the firefighters that night." The world tilted slightly. I'd met several firefighters in the days after. They'd come to the hospital, had brought flowers and gentle words, had told me I was brave for surviving. But I remembered them only as a blur of uniforms and sympathetic faces, too overwhelmed by pain medication and grief to attach names to anyone. "I didn't mean to startle you," Michael continued, his voice carrying across the empty lot with surprising gentleness. "I've driven by here a lot over the years, more than I probably should. I saw your car with the rental plates and I thought maybe—" He trailed off, seemed to reconsider. "I thought if you came back, you deserved to know the truth." Something cold slid down my spine. What truth? He looked down at the ground, at the ash-stained earth that even a decade of rain and seasons hadn't completely washed clean. "Not here, please. There's a diner on Main Street. Betty's. Do you remember it?" I remembered. My parents used to take us there for pancakes after church on Sundays. Danny would always order the chocolate chip ones and then pick out all the chips to eat first, saving the plain pancake for last. The memory hit me like a fist. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, though even as I said it, some part of me already knew I would go. I'd come all this way to understand, and here was someone offering answers, even if I didn't yet know what questions they addressed. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn at the edges, and marked with what looked like official stamps. "Because I've been carrying this for 10 years, and it's been killing me almost as long." We met at Betty's diner 20 minutes later. I'd needed time to sit in my car and remember how to breathe, to call my therapist's voicemail, even though I knew she wouldn't answer, to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles ached and the present felt real enough to inhabit. The diner looked exactly as I remembered. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, the smell of coffee and bacon grease that probably hadn't changed since 1972. Michael was already there, sitting in the back corner booth with 2 cups of coffee and that envelope placed carefully on the table between us like evidence at a trial. I slid into the seat across from him, and up close I could see the lines around his eyes, the tired sag of someone who hasn't slept well in a very long time. "I don't know where to start," he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug as if it were winter instead of a mild October afternoon. "Start with why you're here," I replied. "Why you've been waiting." He nodded slowly, gathering courage or words or both. The official report said the fire started in the kitchen. Faulty wiring in the wall behind the stove. It was ruled accidental. Case closed within 3 weeks. He paused, watching me. But that's not what I saw that night. My throat constricted. "What do you mean?" "When we arrived, the fire was already advanced. Second story fully involved, first floor starting to collapse. We got you out through your bedroom window, and by the time we did, the rest of the house was unsavable. We tried. God knows we tried." His voice cracked slightly. "But by the time we got inside far enough to reach the other bedrooms, it was too late." I'd heard versions of this before. I knew the timeline. I knew that Danny's room had been furthest from the stairs, that my parents had likely died trying to reach him, that my grandmother probably never even woke up. The medical examiner said the smoke got them first, that they didn't suffer the flames. People told me this like it was supposed to be comforting. "I know all that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've read the reports." "But you haven't read this." Michael pushed the envelope toward me. "Because it was never part of the official file. I stared at the envelope. My name was written on it in blue ink, slightly faded, Claire Hensley, with a date below it. October 17th, 2015, the night of the fire. What is this? Open it. My hand shook as I picked it up. The seal had been broken and retaped several times, as if Michael had opened and closed it repeatedly over the years, unable to decide what to do with it. Inside were several items: a set of photographs, what looked like pages from a notebook, and a small evidence bag containing something I couldn't quite make out. The first photograph made my breath stop. It showed the back of our house, specifically the area beneath the kitchen window, and in the harsh glare of the fire truck lights, I could see something I hadn't noticed in any of the other official photos I'd forced myself to look at over the years. A gas can, partially melted, lying in the grass about 15 feet from the foundation. "We found that about 20 minutes into fighting the fire," Michael said quietly. "One of the younger guys, Tommy Chen, spotted it while we were laying additional hose lines. He bagged it before anyone else saw." My mind struggled to process what this meant. "You're saying someone set the fire?" We didn't know. Not for certain. The can could have been from your father's lawnmower, could have been sitting there for weeks. But its position, the way it was lying, Tommy and I both felt wrong about it. So we kept it quiet, just between us, while we looked into things. "Why?" I demanded, anger finally cracking through the numbness. "Why would you keep something like that quiet? If someone killed my family—" "Because we weren't sure," Michael interrupted, his own voice rising with a decade of suppressed anguish. "Because Tommy was 22 years old, and I was trying to protect him from making an accusation that could destroy an innocent person's life. Because the arson investigator had already ruled it accidental, and the case was closing, and we had no proof of anything except a gas can that might mean nothing." He pulled out one of the notebook pages, and I recognized the handwriting as hasty, urgent, notes taken quickly, probably in the middle of the night. We started asking questions, quietly. We talked to neighbors about anything strange they might have seen that evening. We checked the gas can for prints, but the fire had damaged it too badly. We went through every piece of evidence from that night, looking for something concrete. And my voice was barely a whisper. "And we found this." He pulled out the small evidence bag. Inside was a bracelet, silver, tarnished now, with a small charm in the shape of a bird. I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to my mother. She'd worn it every day since her own mother, my grandmother, had given it to her on her 16th birthday. "We found it in the grass near the gas can," Michael said. "Same area, like maybe there'd been a struggle, or someone had been there, or—" He shook his head. "We couldn't make sense of it. Your mother died inside the house. Why would her bracelet be outside?" The diner suddenly felt too small, too hot, the smell of coffee turning my stomach. I tried to remember that night, tried to pull details from the fog of trauma and 10 years of trying to forget. My mother had been wearing the bracelet at dinner. I remembered because Danny had been playing with it, making the charm spin while she talked about her day at work. She'd been annoyed, had pulled her wrist away and told him to stop fidgeting. "Maybe she went outside," I said, though even as I spoke the words felt wrong. "Maybe she smelled gas and went to investigate." "Maybe." Michael didn't sound convinced. "Tommy and I debated what to do for weeks. We took all of this to Fire Chief Bronson privately and asked him what he thought we should do, and that's when everything fell apart." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing several men in uniform standing outside the fire station. I recognized Chief Bronson in the center, a big man with a red face and a reputation for being tough but fair. Michael pointed to another man in the photo, younger, standing slightly apart from the group. "That's Tommy. He died 3 months after the fire. Car accident on Route 22. Single vehicle, late at night. They said he'd been drinking, lost control on a curve. The implication hung in the air between us like smoke. You think someone killed him?" I think Tommy became obsessed with finding answers, and I think he started asking questions to the wrong people, and I think 3 months later he was dead. Michael's jaw tightened. I think Chief Bronson told someone about our investigation, and I think that someone wanted it to stop. Who? I demanded. Who would do this? Who would kill my family and then... I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 10 years. That's why I've been waiting. I thought if you came back, if you looked at everything with fresh eyes, maybe you'd see something I missed. Maybe you'd remember something. I pushed the envelope away, suddenly needing distance from all of it. I was 17 years old. I woke up to smoke and heat and couldn't see anything. I crawled to my window, and that's all I remember clearly until the hospital. I can't give you answers I don't have. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. Michael's voice softened. I'm asking you to help me find them, because whoever did this, whoever killed your family, they're still out there. They've been out there for 10 years, thinking they got away with it. The word murder had been dancing around our conversation, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it real in a way that hollowed out my chest. I'd spent 10 years believing my family died in a terrible accident, carrying survivor's guilt for being the one who made it out. But this was different. This was rage and grief of an entirely different magnitude. What do you want from me? I asked. I want you to help me talk to people who might have known something. I want you to look through these files with me and see if anything sparks a memory. He stopped, swallowed hard. I want to give your family justice, even if it's a decade too late. And I want Tommy's death to mean something. I looked at the photographs spread across the table, at the bracelet in its evidence bag, at the notebook pages filled with questions that had no answers. Part of me wanted to sweep all of it back into the envelope, get in my car, and drive back to Philadelphia and the carefully constructed life I'd built, where the past stayed buried and manageable. But another part of me, the part that had brought me back to Millbrook in the first place, knew I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when someone was finally telling me that what I'd survived wasn't just tragedy, but crime. Okay, I said. Where do we start? We started with the neighbors. Michael had made a list years ago of everyone who'd lived on Oakwood Avenue the night of the fire, and while some had moved away, several remained. Our first stop was Mrs. Olensky, who'd lived 2 houses down and had been the one to call 911 when she saw flames through my parents' kitchen window. She answered her door in a cardigan despite the mild weather, her hair white now instead of the grey I vaguely remembered. And when she saw me, her eyes filled with immediate tears. Claire. Oh, sweet girl. I'd hoped I'd never have to think about that night again. But she let us in, made tea that neither Michael nor I touched, and sat in her living room with its outdated wallpaper and surfaces covered in photographs of grandchildren I assumed lived far away. I've been over it 1,000 times in my mind, she said, when Michael explained why we'd come. I went to bed around 10 that night, and I was woken up by sirens. At first I thought they were going past, but then I looked out my window and saw the flames. Your parents' house was completely engulfed on the 2nd floor. Did you see anyone outside? Any cars you didn't recognize on the street? Michael asked gently. Mrs. Olensky frowned, concentrating. There was a truck parked across the street. I remember thinking it was odd, because usually only residents park on our block, and I didn't recognize it. But it was dark, and I was focused on the fire, and by the time the fire trucks arrived, the other truck was gone. What kind of truck? I asked, leaning forward. What color? Dark. Maybe blue or black. One of those pickup trucks with the extended cab. She shook her head. I told the police this at the time, but they said there was nothing unusual about it. Lots of people have trucks. We asked about my parents, about whether they'd mentioned any problems, financial trouble, arguments with neighbors, anything that might point toward a motive, But Mrs. Olenski had only kind memories. My father helping her carry groceries, my mother organizing the neighborhood watch meetings. Danny and I playing basketball in the driveway and accidentally hitting her mailbox with the ball. They were good people, she said, and the past tense made my chest ache. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt them. Our next stop was the Garrett family, who'd lived directly across the street. Mark Garrett answered the door, and I remembered him vaguely. He'd been in his 30s back then, with a wife and a baby daughter. He looked weathered now, with the kind of tiredness that suggested life had not been particularly kind. "I wondered if you'd ever come back," he said when he saw me, which seemed like an odd greeting until he explained. "Your dad and I used to talk over the fence sometimes. He was a good man, didn't deserve what happened." "We're trying to understand more about that night," Michael said, and something in Mark's expression shifted, became guarded, uncomfortable. "I don't know what I can tell you that I didn't tell the investigators back then." "Tell us anyway," I said. "Please." He sighed and stepped out onto his porch rather than inviting us inside. "I worked nights back then, security at the warehouse over in Morristown. I left for my shift around 11 that evening. Your house was fine when I drove past it. All the lights were off except for the one in your mom and dad's bedroom. That's the last I saw before everything." He trailed off. "Did you see anyone else around? Any vehicles?" Michael pressed. Mark hesitated, and in that hesitation I sensed something unspoken. There might have been a truck down the street. I didn't think much of it at the time. "A dark pickup truck?" I asked, remembering Mrs. Olenski's description. Maybe it was dark and I was in a hurry to get to work. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes. Pity mixed with knowledge. "Look, Claire, some things are better left buried. Your family's gone, and knowing why won't bring them back. It'll just hurt more." "I deserve to know," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I deserve the truth." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Check with Jim Patterson at the fire station. He's retired now, lives over on Elm Street. He was there that night too, and he saw things that never made it into any official report." We died that evening, after a day of conversations that raised more questions than they answered. Michael and I sat in his truck outside the Millbrook Public Library. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene in their beauty, given the darkness we were excavating. "Jim Patterson transferred to a different district 2 months after the fire," Michael said. "I tried to talk to him once, about a year after Tommy died, but he wouldn't see me. Told me through his door that he had nothing to say." "Why would Mark Garrett tell us to talk to him if he's not willing to talk?" "Maybe things have changed. Maybe enough time has passed that the fear has faded." Michael rubbed his face tiredly. "Or maybe Mark knows something and wants someone else to tell you, so he doesn't have to." We found Jim Patterson's address in the phone book. Yes, Millbrook still had paper phone books, and drove to a small house with a neglected lawn and newspapers piled on the porch. No one answered when we knocked. The neighbors said they hadn't seen him in a few days, which either meant he was avoiding us or something worse. I spent that night in a motel on the edge of town, lying awake on sheets that smelled of bleach and trying to reconcile the family I remembered with the idea that someone had hated them enough to kill them. I thought about my father's laugh, the way he'd make terrible jokes at breakfast that had us all groaning. My mother's hands always busy, always creating. She sewed our Halloween costumes and baked bread on Sundays and maintained a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Danny, who'd been 13 and just starting to care about girls and music and being cool, who'd still let me hang out with him and his friends because he was kinder than most teenage boys. And my grandmother, who'd moved in with us after my grandfather died, who smelled like lavender and told stories about growing up during the Depression, who'd taught me to play gin rummy and always let me win. Who would want them dead? The questions circled my brain until the sky outside started to lighten and I gave up on sleep entirely. I showered, dressed, and drove back to the lot on Oakwood Avenue, drawn there by a need I couldn't articulate. The morning was cold, frost glazing the dead grass, and in the early light the ruins looked even more desolate than they had the day before. I stood where the front door used to be and tried to remember entering this house on that last evening. Dinner had been spaghetti and meatballs, Danny's favorite. We'd watched a movie afterward, something with superheroes that I couldn't recall now. I'd gone to bed around 10, reading a book for English class until my eyes got heavy. Had there been sounds in the night? Had I heard anything that might have been someone outside, pouring gasoline, preparing to destroy everything I loved? "I'm sorry," I whispered to the empty air, to the ghosts of my family. "I'm so sorry I didn't wake up sooner. I'm sorry I didn't save you." The wind picked up, rustling through the weeds, and for a moment I let myself imagine it was their response. Absolution I didn't deserve but needed anyway. Talking to yourself or to them? I spun around to find a woman standing at the edge of the property, maybe in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back and intelligent eyes behind glasses. She wore a blazer and carried herself with the air of someone used to authority. "I'm sorry," she said, holding up a hand. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm Detective Sarah Torres with the State Police. I wondered if I might have a word with you." My heart rate spiked. "About what?" "About why you've been asking questions about a decade-old case that was ruled accidental." She said it gently but firmly. "Mind if we talk?" We ended up back at Betty's diner, because apparently that's where all meaningful conversations in Millbrook happened. Detective Torres ordered coffee and pie, which seemed surreal given the circumstances, but she insisted that some conversations required carbohydrates. "I'm not here in an official capacity," she said once the waitress had left. "I'm here because someone filed a complaint yesterday that you and Michael Reeves are harassing residents about the fire. And because that complaint came from the police chief's office, which raised some flags for me. We're not harassing anyone. We're just trying to understand what really happened. Michael showed you evidence that was never part of the official investigation." Not a question. The gas can, the bracelet, Tommy Chen's notes. "How do you know about that?" Torres took a bite of pie before answering. "Because I'm the detective who investigated Tommy Chen's death, and I've never been satisfied with the drunk driving conclusion. Tommy's blood alcohol level was .08, barely over the legal limit, and everyone I talked to said he wasn't the type to drive drunk. He was careful, responsible, and in the weeks before he died, he'd been acting paranoid, told his roommate someone was following him. The pieces were starting to form a picture, though the image was still too blurred to make out clearly. You think the two cases are connected? I think Tommy Chen found out something about your family's fire, and I think it got him killed. I think Michael Reeves has been too scared to pursue it further because he didn't want to end up the same way. And I think you coming back here might finally shake loose the truth." "Then help us," I said. "Help us figure out who did this." Torres was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What I'm about to tell you is technically off the record because the cases are closed and I have no jurisdiction here. But there are some things you should know." She pulled out a folder from her bag. Apparently everyone in this town carried around secret evidence, and opened it to show me a photograph of a man I didn't recognize. He was maybe 50, with thinning hair and cold eyes, wearing what looked like a business suit. "This is Richard Carlson. He owned several properties in Millbrook back in 2015, including the warehouse where Mark Garrett worked. He was investigated for insurance fraud 5 years ago, allegedly paid someone to burn down one of his buildings, but the charges didn't stick. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared." My pulse quickened. "You think he's involved?" "I think your family's property was assessed at $300,000, and I think someone bought it from the insurance company for $50,000 after the fire. I think that someone was Richard Carlson through a shell company. I think he intended to flip it or develop it, but public sentiment after what happened to your family made it too controversial, so it's just sat there." "That's not enough," I said, frustration rising. "That's coincidence and speculation." "You're right, which is why I need more." Torres leaned forward. "Tommy Chen's notes mention a name, just a first name, scribbled in the margins. Vic. Mean anything to you?" I searched my memory, but nothing surfaced. "No. Should it?" Richard Carlson's right-hand man, the guy who handled all his property deals, was named Victor Mendez. He disappeared 2 months after your fire. Just vanished. Family filed a missing person report, but he's never been found. The waitress came by to refill our coffee, and we all sat in tense silence until she left. My mind was racing, trying to connect threads that felt just out of reach. "If Carlson wanted our property, why kill everyone?" I asked. "Why not just, I don't know, make an offer?" "Because your father had refused to sell," Torres said quietly. 3 times, according to property records. Carlson had approached him about buying the house and the large lot it sat on, prime location for development. Your father said no every time, said it was your family's home and you weren't interested in selling. I hadn't known this, had never known that anyone had wanted to buy our house, but that was typical of my father. He wouldn't have troubled us kids with adult concerns about money and property. So Carlson killed 5 people for a piece of property? The enormity of it was suffocating. I think Carlson had Victor Mendez handle it. I think Victor set the fire, maybe not intending to kill anyone, maybe thinking the family would escape and the house would just burn down and your father would take the insurance money and go away. But something went wrong. The fire spread faster than expected, or the smoke detectors malfunctioned, or... Torres shook her head. Intention doesn't matter when the result is 5 people dead. And Tommy Chen figured this out. I think Tommy found evidence that pointed toward Victor Mendez. I think he either confronted Mendez directly or went to Carlson, threatening to expose him. And I think Carlson, or someone working for him, made sure Tommy couldn't talk. But you can't prove any of this. No, I can't. That's why I'm telling you instead of pursuing it officially. Without concrete evidence, without a witness, without a body, I have nothing. Just a theory that sounds like a conspiracy. I sat back against the vinyl booth, feeling the weight of 10 years of grief, compounded by the knowledge that it was all preventable, all the result of human greed and violence. So what do I do? You be careful, Torres said firmly. You understand that if I'm right, you're threatening someone who has already killed at least 6 people to protect his interests. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't trust anyone who approaches you out of the blue, and you call me immediately if you feel threatened. She slid her card across the table, and I took it with shaking hands. In the meantime, Torres continued, I'm going to dig deeper into Carlson's finances. See if I can find any unusual transactions around the time of your fire or Tommy's death. Sometimes people get careless. Sometimes money leaves a trail. After Torres left, I sat alone in the booth and stared at my cold coffee. Everything I'd believed about that night had been a lie. My family hadn't died in a tragic accident. They'd been murdered, and the man who'd ordered their deaths was still free, still living his life, probably sleeping fine at night. I called Michael and told him everything Torres had said. He listened in silence, and when I finished, I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. I should have done more, he said finally. I should have fought harder to investigate. I should have... You were scared. Tommy was dead. I get it. I did get it, though part of me was angry anyway. Angry at him, at the police, at Chief Bronson, who'd apparently leaked information, at every person who'd known something was wrong and said nothing. What do you want to do now? Michael asked. What I wanted was to burn the world down. What I wanted was to make Richard Carlson feel every ounce of pain my family had felt. What I wanted was impossible. "I want to talk to Jim Patterson," I said instead. "If he was there that night, if he saw something, I need to know what it was." We tried Patterson's house again that afternoon, and this time an old Ford pickup was in the driveway, rust eating at the wheel wells, a sticker for a volunteer fire department barely visible on the back window. Michael knocked while I stood slightly behind him, and after a long moment the door opened a crack. Jim Patterson looked like he'd aged 20 years in 10. His face was gaunt, his hair completely grey, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the doorframe. When he saw Michael, something like panic flashed across his features. "I told you, I have nothing to say. Jim, please, this is Claire Hensley. She deserves to know what you saw." Patterson's eyes found mine, and I saw the weight of guilt in them, heavy enough to sink a ship. He swallowed hard, started to close the door, then stopped. "5 minutes," he said. "That's all you get." His living room was dark, curtains drawn, the air stale, like no window had been opened in years. We sat on a couch that sagged in the middle while Patterson remained standing, arms crossed over his thin chest like armor. "I saw Victor Mendez that night," he said without preamble. "I saw him in the backyard of your house just before we arrived. He was getting into a truck, dark blue pickup, and he was moving fast, like he was running from something." My breath caught. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Chief Bronson the next day, told him I recognized Mendez from around town, that I'd seen him leaving the property. The chief told me I was mistaken, that the smoke and chaos had confused me, that Mendez was a respected businessman who had no reason to be involved." Patterson's voice was bitter. "2 weeks later I got a visit. 2 men in a car that waited outside my house until I came home from my shift. They didn't threaten me directly. Just told me it would be a shame if something happened to my family. I had a wife and 2 daughters. "So you said nothing," I said, not quite able to keep the accusation from my tone. "So I said nothing," he agreed, and the shame in his voice was palpable. "And then Tommy Chen died, and I knew that speaking up meant dying. I transferred districts. I stopped going to fire department events. I basically disappeared from anything connected to Millbrook." "But you're still alive," Michael pointed out, "which means they either forgot about you or decided you weren't a threat. Or they're waiting to see if I talk to the wrong person." Patterson looked at me. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was a coward. I'm sorry your family didn't get justice because I was too scared to risk mine. I've thought about it every day for 10 years. The apology didn't make me feel better, but I understood it. Fear is powerful, and people with families to protect will sacrifice almost anything, including their conscience, to keep them safe." "Can you testify?" I asked. "If Detective Torres finds enough evidence to reopen the case, will you testify to what you saw?" Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "If it comes to that, yes, I'll testify. I'm old now. My daughters are grown and moved away. My wife left me 3 years ago because living with my guilt was poisoning our marriage. I don't have much left to lose except the small shred of dignity I might earn by finally doing the right thing." It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was a witness who could place Victor Mendez at the scene. It was a crack in the wall of silence that had stood for a decade. Michael and I left Patterson's house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red that looked like fire, and I felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become hope. Not justice yet, maybe not ever, but at least the possibility of truth. "We need to find Richard Carlson," I said as we sat in Michael's truck. "We need to confront him." "That's dangerous," Michael warned. "If Torres is right, if he's killed before, I don't care." And I meant it. The fear that had paralyzed everyone else didn't touch me the same way. I'd already lost everything. What more could Carlson take? I need to look him in the eye. I need him to know that I know. We found Carlson's address through public records. A large house on the expensive side of town, where the lots were measured in acres and the driveways were gated. Michael drove past it twice, and I could see the lights on inside, could see what looked like a dinner party through the big windows, people laughing and drinking wine like they weren't monsters. "We can't just knock on his door," Michael said reasonably. "He'll call the police." Then we wait. I was already opening my phone, pulling up Detective Torres's number. We wait until he's alone, and we make sure Torres knows where we are, and we record everything. Torres answered on the second ring, and when I explained what we wanted to do, I could practically hear her shaking her head. But she also didn't tell us not to do it. "If you're going to confront him, do it in a public place during the day," she said. "Somewhere with witnesses. And yes, record everything. Pennsylvania is a two-party consent state for recordings, but if he's admitting to murder, I'll find a way to make it admissible." "Where does he work?" I asked. "He has an office downtown above the pharmacy, Carlson Development. But Claire—" Torres paused. "Be prepared for him to deny everything. Be prepared for him to be convincing. These people don't survive this long without being good liars." The next morning, I dressed like I was going to war, not in armor but in my strongest clothes, the ones that made me feel capable and adult. Michael picked me up at the motel, and I could see he'd barely slept either. "You don't have to do this," he said as we drove toward downtown Millbrook. "Yes, I do." Carlson Development occupied a suite of offices above Millbrook Pharmacy, accessed by a narrow staircase between storefronts. The walls were decorated with photos of properties and developments, smiling families in front of new houses, progress shots of construction sites. It all looked so legitimate, so normal, that for a moment I doubted myself. Surely a man who conducted this much business in the open couldn't be a murderer. But then I remembered Tommy Chen's car accident, remembered Jim Patterson's fear, remembered my family's bodies pulled from the ruins of our home. A receptionist greeted us. A young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, bright smile and professionally welcoming. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I need to speak with Mr. Carlson about a property matter. It's urgent." Something in my tone must have convinced her, because she picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it. A moment later, a door at the back of the office opened, and Richard Carlson emerged. He looked older than his photograph, heavier, with that particular kind of success that comes from years of money and comfort. His suit was expensive. His watch probably cost more than I made in 6 months. And his smile was professionally welcoming, right up until he got close enough to really look at me. Then something flickered in his eyes, recognition or calculation or both. "Claire Hensley," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been expecting someone from your family to show up eventually." The admission stunned me. I'd prepared for denial, for confusion, for hostility. I hadn't prepared for acknowledgement. "Can we talk in your office?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite my racing pulse. "Of course." He gestured toward the door he'd emerged from, pleasant and urbane, like he was inviting me to discuss insurance rates rather than murder. His office was tastefully decorated, dark wood furniture, leather chairs, framed awards on the walls. Michael and I sat across from his desk, and I pulled out my phone, placing it obviously on the desk between us. "I'm recording this conversation," I said. "That's fine." Carlson leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. "I assume you're here about the fire. You know I am. And you've figured out that it wasn't an accident. Clever girl. Your father was clever too. He would have been proud." The casual way he invoked my father made rage bloom hot in my chest. "Did you kill my family?" "Personally, no. I've never killed anyone with my own hands." He said it like he was proud of the distinction. "I simply made it known that I needed your father's property for a development project, and I suggested that it would be easier if the house was destroyed and your family motivated to sell." "You hired Victor Mendez." Victor was overzealous. His instructions were to make the fire look accidental, ensure the family evacuated safely, and create enough damage that your father would take the insurance money and move on. But Victor had his own problems, gambling debts mostly, and he saw an opportunity. He thought if your whole family died, there'd be no one to contest the insurance payout, no one to investigate too closely. The property would go to auction, and I could buy it cheaply. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was describing a business transaction rather than the murder of 5 people. "Where is Victor Mendez now?" Michael asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Dead. He tried to extort me for more money after the fire, threatened to go to the police if I didn't pay. I couldn't allow that." Carlson shrugged. "His body is somewhere in the woods outside town. I honestly don't remember exactly where. It's been 10 years. The casual admission of multiple murders was surreal. I kept expecting him to stop, to realize what he was saying, but he just kept talking like this was normal. "And Tommy Chen? The young firefighter?" "Yes. He figured out too much. A car accident is easy to arrange if you know the right people." Carlson looked at me with something almost like sympathy. "You have to understand, Claire, I'm not a monster. I'm a businessman. Sometimes business requires difficult decisions." "You killed my family for a piece of property," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You killed my brother. He was 13 years old. And I'm sorry about that. Truly. That was Victor's doing, not mine. But what's done is done, and revisiting it won't bring them back. You're admitting to multiple murders." "I'm admitting to nothing that will hold up in court," Carlson said, and now his smile had an edge. "You're recording this conversation, yes, but in Pennsylvania that requires 2-party consent. Anything I've said is inadmissible. And even if it weren't, I'm a respected businessman with no criminal record and an excellent legal team. You're a traumatized young woman with no evidence except the word of scared firefighters and conspiracy theories. Detective Torres is investigating you. She's looking at your finances. Detective Torres has been poking around for years. She's never found anything, and she won't. I'm very good at covering my tracks." He leaned forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen, Claire. You're going to take your recording and your grief, and you're going to go back to Philadelphia or wherever you came from. You're going to accept that sometimes bad things happen and justice doesn't exist. And if you're smart, you'll move on with your life and not end up like Tommy Chen or Victor Mendez. Is that a threat?" "It's practical advice." He stood, signaling the end of our conversation. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Please see yourselves out." Michael and I left the office in stunned silence, and it wasn't until we were back in his truck that I realized I was shaking. Not just from anger, but from the horrifying realization that Carlson was probably right. His confession meant nothing if I couldn't use it in court. And without concrete evidence, without Victor Mendez's body, without financial records that proved payment for murder, I had nothing. "He's not going to get away with this," Michael said fiercely. "We'll find something. He already has gotten away with it," I interrupted. "For 10 years he's gotten away with it, and he'll keep getting away with it because he's rich and connected and smart enough to insulate himself from consequences." I called Torres from the parking lot and told her everything Carlson had said. She listened, asked clarifying questions, and I could hear her frustration matching mine. "He's right about the recording being inadmissible," she said finally. "But he's wrong that I haven't found anything. I've been tracking his financial records for the past 24 hours, and there's a pattern of payments to an LLC that dissolved 2 months after your fire. The LLC was registered to Victor Mendez. I'm working with federal investigators now. If I can connect those payments to the fire, I can charge Carlson with conspiracy and wire fraud, even if I can't prove the murder." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, maybe months. These things don't move fast." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the truck's headrest, After 10 years of believing my family's death was an accident, after days of learning it was murder, after an hour of hearing the murderer confess directly to my face, I still had to wait, still had to live with uncertainty and rage, and no resolution. "Claire," Torres said gently, "I know this isn't what you want to hear, but sometimes justice is slow, sometimes it's incomplete, but I promise you, I will do everything in my power to make sure Richard Carlson answers for what he's done." That night, I went back to the lot on Oakwood Avenue one more time. The sun was setting, and in the golden light, the overgrown weeds looked almost beautiful, like the earth was trying to heal itself after violence. I stood where the front door had been and spoke to my family out loud, not caring if anyone heard. I told them I loved them. I told them I was sorry it took me so long to figure out the truth. I told them that the man who killed them had confessed, even if justice remained uncertain. I told them I missed Danny's laugh and Mom's cooking and Dad's terrible jokes and Grandma's stories. And then I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I cried, not the careful, controlled tears I'd shed in therapy or in private moments, but huge, racking sobs that came from the deepest parts of grief. I cried for everything we'd lost, for the future that had been stolen, for the sheer unfairness of it all. When I finally stopped, when I'd emptied myself of tears, I felt lighter. Not healed, not even close to okay, but lighter. Like I'd been carrying something impossibly heavy and had finally been able to set it down, even temporarily. I pulled out my phone and bought a tree. Not metaphorically, literally. A cherry blossom tree from a local nursery that promised next-day delivery. I arranged for it to be planted in the middle of the lot, right where our living room used to be, something alive and beautiful to mark the place where my family had lived and died. The nursery asked what I wanted on the plaque, and I kept it simple. In memory of the Hensley family. May they rest in peace. Over the next 2 weeks, I stayed in Millbrook while Torres and federal investigators built their case against Richard Carlson. I visited the cemetery where my family was buried, placing flowers on each headstone and talking to them like they could hear. I had coffee with Michael, who was seeing a therapist now for the guilt he'd carried for a decade. I checked in with Jim Patterson, who seemed fractionally less haunted now that he'd told the truth, and I started writing. Not for publication, not for anyone but myself. I wrote down every memory I had of my family, the good ones, the mundane ones, even the arguments and frustrations. I wrote about what happened that night and everything I'd learned since. I wrote about justice and grief and the horrible truth that sometimes the bad guys win. Torres called me on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd arrived in Millbrook. "We arrested Richard Carlson an hour ago. Wire fraud, conspiracy, and we're building toward a murder charge based on the financial evidence and Jim Patterson's testimony. It's not guaranteed, but it's something." It was something. Not enough, maybe never enough, but something. I stayed in Millbrook for the arraignment, watching from the courtroom gallery, as Carlson was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of an expensive suit. He saw me and smiled, like this was all just a temporary inconvenience, like his lawyers would have him out by dinner. But I smiled back, because I knew something he didn't. Torres had told me the federal investigators had found Victor Mendez's body based on property records showing where Carlson owned land. They'd found dental records that matched. They'd found evidence that would connect Carlson directly to the murder. Justice might be slow, but it was coming. I left Millbrook on a Tuesday in early December, a month after I'd arrived. The cherry blossom tree had been planted, its bare branches stark against the winter sky but alive, ready to bloom in spring. I stood beside it and said goodbye to my family one more time, promising to come back when the blossoms opened. Michael drove me to the airport, and we sat in his truck outside departures, making awkward conversation until it was time for me to go. "Thank you," I said finally, "for waiting, for keeping that evidence all these years, for not giving up." I should have done more, he said, the guilt still there, but maybe, possibly, starting to ease. We all should have. But we're doing it now, and that matters. On the plane back to Philadelphia, I thought about what comes next. I thought about returning to my job, to my apartment, to the careful life I'd built that now felt both foreign and familiar. I thought about therapy and healing and whether I'd ever really be okay. I thought about Danny and whether he'd like the cherry blossom tree. He probably would have teased me about being